Hey guys, it's Miss Carlson, and I'm going to talk to you today about evolution, which is covered in chapter 16 and 17 of our textbook. Chapter 16 will be mainly an overview with a little bit more detail in sections 3 and 4. And then 17 I'm going to get into detail because it's our newer chapter and it's applying evolution to populations. So go ahead and make sure you're ready with a notebook sheet of paper set up for Cornell Notes or a Cornell note-taking template. And we're going to go ahead and get started with Darwin's voyage and his ideas. In these sections of the chapter, they basically explain what evolution is. It's a process of change over time, and Darwin believed that this explained how organisms change and how we all come from a common ancestor. Now, I'm going to show you a picture here of the Android software that is used to power many of our phones has evolved over time. This is kind of an analogy to how this works with organisms. Now, Android software, they use these pictures of different food items to designate the name of their new software. And as we've gone through, we started off with cupcake, donut, then eclair, frozen yogurt, gingerbread, honeycomb, ice cream sandwich, jelly bean, and key lime pie. As you can imagine, over time, basically that software has become more powerful. It's become more competitive with the Apple phones and therefore has been able to survive over time. Now, organisms work in a very similar way, although the pressures that are placed on organisms are through nature or from nature for the most part. But in order to survive over time, they have to adapt. They have to have a high level of fitness and reproduce and pass on those good traits. So let's go ahead and look at some of Darwin's observations. Basically, he just noticed in all of his travels and journeys that the diversity of all the organisms that we have was very great. So the variations of organisms on our planet were high, and we call that biodiversity. And species could vary globally, they can vary locally, and they can vary over time. And one of the examples of a local example of the Galapagos Islands that Darwin looked at was the tortoises on the different islands. And on Hood Island, he noticed that there were turtles with long necks and curved shells because the sparse high vegetation that was available to them made them more suitable for that environment. On the Isabella Island, the turtles had short necks and a dome shell, being more suitable for the vegetation that was abundant and close to the ground on that island. So this was an example of how a species can vary locally according to the availability of food. Now, another thing that Darwin noticed were fossils. These are preserved remains or traces of ancient organisms. We've all seen fossils rearranged, put back together of the dinosaurs. There's also the common trilobites that are sometimes embedded in different stones and whatnot. And all of these show that extinct animals are similar to living species. And that helps provide us with an idea that organisms have changed over time as well. Some other influences that Darwin used to kind of shape his theory are the fact that Earth is ancient and it is changing. Geologists Hunton and Lyell basically proved that Earth was extremely old and that the processes like volcanic eruptions, rivers, basically carving through the Earth are processes that changed Earth in the past and they do now. So the fact that Earth has been around for a long time gave Darwin enough time to prove that evolution could occur. Other scientists in Darwin's time that had different ideas, like Lamarck, his hypothesis was that a use or a lack of use could cause a change during a lifetime. He used this to explain the difference between long and short-necked giraffes and why the short-necked giraffe basically disappeared. This idea is incorrect for many reasons. Organisms don't have this idea of perfection. They don't get better. They adapt over long periods of time in order to survive in an environment. Also, traits acquired in a lifetime cannot be passed on from one generation to the next. It's normally not something genetically inheritable. It could be acquired from environmental reasons. But Lamarck did propose the idea that there is a change in species over time, and he suggested that species are not fixed. Population growth was also a concern when Darwin was proposing his theory of evolution, and Malthus kind of helped him out with this and said there are reasons for checks on growth. For example, maple trees make thousands of seeds, but they don't all grow. Oysters make millions of eggs, but you don't have them all hatching. And this could explain why evolution occurred But Darwin still had to kind of think about why do some survive and why do some not. So that continues to build on our ideas. Now, so this leads us into the idea of artificial selection. Some things can be selected purposely by humans. Okay, we can select for useful traits that nature provides to us. For example, chickens that hatch many eggs, horses that race quickly, and strawberries that are very large compared to others, because more food is good, and for people that like to race horses for monetary purposes, they would probably want to breed a fast horse, kind of like Secretariat, like we talked about in class. So artificial selection is purposely done, while natural selection happens and occurs in nature by its own means. So Darwin then presents his case knowing all of this, and he has deemed organisms with the traits most suitable for its environment will have a greater level of fitness, and he called that natural selection. Now, traits that are suitable are called adaptations, and in order to be considered having a high level of fitness, you have to survive and reproduce. So this is all controlled by a struggle for existence between organisms, and this could be food, living space, necessities of life. Otherwise, would determine how fit you are and if you are going to survive over time. Then that jumps in, or takes us to Darwin's idea of common descent. Natural selection will leave descendants. So those that are well adapted and survive over time are going to have offspring, which are descendants. And all species, whether or not they're living or extinct, do descend from a common ancestor, and we can trace this back many millions of years, and Darwin had his own little picture idea here that started off this whole idea. But this descent does happen with modification, which is where the evolution or the evolving of organisms actually comes in. Alright, the last thing we're going to talk about in chapter 16 is just putting all this evidence together, which is provided in section 4. One piece of evidence that's important to point out is biogeography. This is the distribution of living organisms versus their fossils. Helps us see a pattern over time. The age of the earth, which we already discussed. Fossils, we can actually trace a series from modern to extinct and see the physical changes. Homologous structures, there are structures that are shared by related species but have modified over time for different purposes. As you can see here, and we've talked a little bit about this in class, the bones that are the same color are homologous structures but are now being used in a different way. Now, analogous structures are structures that are used for the same purpose but in different organisms, like a dinosaur or a bat and a bird wing. They're all used for flying purposes. Vestigial structures are structures that were once served a purpose but through modification over time are not necessary anymore, like a dolphin hip bone. Dolphins are believed to have evolved from a terrestrial creature where a hip bone would be necessary, but now that they are water creatures, it would not be needed. And lastly, molecular biology, which deals with the genetic code and the similarity in the patterns of the DNA code would tell you how closely related they are in a common ancestor. Alright, so now that we're done with chapter 16, I'm going to jump you into chapter 17, which takes our knowledge of genetics and our basic understanding of evolution and applies it to populations of organisms. Now, we know that natural selection will act directly on the phenotype, or the outward physical characteristic we can see. Some are better suited than others depending on the environment. If you have a higher level of fitness, your trait is going to be passed on. And if you remember, those traits are controlled by alleles. So, alleles that remain are passed on. If those organisms have a low level of fitness, their alleles are going to be removed from the gene pool. Take a look at this population of frogs. In front of you is the population's gene pool with just all the genes that are in a population at a given time. Now, what I've given you here is the allele frequency which is the number of times an allele is seen in a given pool of a population. So 1 out of 15 are red, 2 out of 15 are blue, and 12 out of 15 are green. If this changes over time, then you have a population that is evolving. If it doesn't, then you do not. And at that current time, that population is relatively stable, or something called genetic equilibrium is occurring, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, natural selection on populations occurs in two ways. With single gene traits, it's really simple. You'll see a change in allele frequency leading to a phenotype change, like with our frogs. Maybe over time, for some reason, nature selects for the blue to be more popular, because maybe that is a particularly desirable trait when it comes to sexual reproduction. Now, with polygenic traits, there's more complexity involved, and what actually happens are three different types of selection. We have directional selection, we have stabilizing selection, and we also have disruptive selection, and I'm going to show you the difference between those in this diagram here. So the dashed line shows you the original distribution of the phenotype of the population, and then the solid line shows you the new distribution. With directional selection, you just get a shift. So if we were looking at beak size in a population of birds, it goes from this original distribution to a shift to a larger size, where it's peaking here in the new distribution. So it's just a shift, average beak size increases. Stabilizing selection, now take an example of birth mass in a percentage of a human population, and the average mass that's most likely to survive is in the middle. It's not too low and it's not too high. So it's the middle phenotype that is usually seen in stabilizing selection. And lastly, in this bird population, we're looking at beak size again. Let's just say that the smaller beaks and the larger beaks, for some reason, are more suitable for the environment than the average or the middle-sized beak. And so when the extremes are what are chosen, we have disruptive selection. All right, lastly, other ways for change. You have something called genetic drift, and this is just a random change in allele frequency. And so what happens over time, an allele may become more or less frequent due to some incident. This could be a disaster or a disease, which could lead to a bottleneck effect. Showing you in this picture here, if you have this is your original population and you have something that causes a bottleneck effect, like a disease that wipes a bunch out, your surviving population might look like this, and you would actually possibly lead to less diversity in that population. And then there's also the founder effect, which is a result of migration mostly, and can be seen in this picture here. So if you have this sample of an original population and maybe they dispersed onto two different islands, so one founding population might have been these two types of bugs, and the other founding population on a different island could have been these guys, and so over time the descendants on the island would just look like this population from population A and this population from population B, whereas the original population might have been all mixed together. So that about wraps it up. The last thing we need to talk about is genetic equilibrium, and that's when a population is not evolving. And this happens when allele frequencies go unchanged. And this is because sexual reproduction cannot change allele frequency alone. And so generally something has to happen within nature to basically push organisms into evolving. Genetic recombination, remember, is how sexual reproduction can cause change, but may not, and that's during crossing over of in the process of producing gametes. Now, other sources of variation are mutations and lateral gene transfer. Mutations, remember, occur in our DNA, which again can be random, and then lateral gene transfer really only occurs in single-celled organisms, and that's not something we talk about heavily. Otherwise, that officially wraps us up for chapter 16 and 17. I know that's a lot. Make sure you go back and you took good notes. After your notes are all done, remember, write those good questions to kind of help your thought process when you go back and study these for our test in the future. I'll talk to you later.